I'm a 29-year-old woman, and my relationship with my mom 55F has always been a mess. She's the kind of person who can't let a problem go without finding someone to blame, and that someone is almost always me. It doesn't matter what the issue is, whether it's something minor like the wrong brand of cereal in the cupboard or something major like a family fight, she always finds a way to turn it back on me. My younger brother, though, he's 25 and basically a saint in her eyes. He's the golden child, the one who can do no wrong. For as long as I can remember, my mom has acted like I'm some kind of curse on the family. When my parents divorced, I was just 12 years old, and even then, she managed to pin it on me. She'd tell anyone who would listen that my difficult attitude made things harder for everyone, conveniently ignoring the screaming matches between her and my dad or the fact that I was just a kid, trying to figure out why my home was falling apart. Things didn't get better as I got older. If anything, they got worse. By the time I was a teenager, my mom had perfected the art of scapegoating. If she forgot to pay a bill and got hit with a late fee, it was because I distracted her. If my brother's grades slipped, it was because I didn't set a good example. If the dog ran away, it was my fault for leaving the gate open, even if I wasn't the one who let the dog out that day. I learned early on that arguing was pointless. She never admitted she was wrong, and fighting back just made her angrier. Recently, things reached a boiling point. Christmas was always a stressful time in our family, but this year was especially bad. I'd been saving up to get gifts for everyone, but money was tight. I could only afford something small for my brother, nothing extravagant, just a practical gift I knew he'd use. My mom, however, had other ideas. She'd already bragged to the whole family about the amazing gift I'd supposedly bought him. When I explained that I couldn't afford something expensive, she flipped out. Apparently, I was ruining Christmas and letting everyone down. That night, I started thinking about all the times she'd pulled this kind of stunt. Every single family problem, no matter how unrelated to me, somehow became my fault. The missed bills, the arguments, even random things like my aunt not coming to a party, it was always on me. I realized that this wasn't just about Christmas or a bad day. This was a pattern, and it had been going on for years. I wasn't just her scapegoat, I was her punching bag. The breaking point came a week later. My brother had been interviewing for a new job, and when he didn't get it, my mom immediately decided I was the reason. According to her, I distracted him by asking too many questions about the interview process. Never mind that he'd asked for my advice or that I had absolutely nothing to do with the outcome. It was easier for her to blame me than to accept that maybe the job just wasn't a good fit. At first, I wanted to confront her. I wanted to lay everything out and make her see how unfair she was being. But then I realized something. Arguing wouldn't change anything. She wasn't going to suddenly admit she was wrong. Instead, I decided to take a different approach. I started keeping track of everything. Every time she blamed me for something I didn't do. Every time she twisted the truth to make herself look better. Every time she deflected her mistakes onto someone else. It wasn't just for me, either. My brother had grown up hearing the same narrative, that I was the problem and he was the golden child. I don't think he's a bad person, but he spent his whole life being sheltered from the consequences of our mom's behavior. He genuinely believes she's always right because he's never had to question her. If I wanted to break this cycle, I'd need more than just my word against hers. As I started gathering evidence, I noticed a pattern. My mom's behavior wasn't just random, it was strategic. She'd deflect blame whenever she felt cornered, twisting the situation until someone else, usually me, looked like the villain. And the rest of the family? They went along with it. My dad, my cousins, even my aunts and uncles, they all stayed silent, either because they didn't want to cause conflict or because they'd been manipulated into thinking she was right. I wasn't sure how far I'd take this plan, but one thing was clear, I wasn't going to sit back and let her keep using me as her scapegoat. Whether it was a family gathering, a holiday, or just another random day, I was ready to start pushing back. Quietly, carefully, and with a plan. The next time she tried to throw me under the bus, I'd be ready. This time, the truth would be on my side. Update 1. The dinner party was at my aunt's house. It was supposed to be a casual family get-together, but anyone who knew our family knew that casual and family didn't mix well when my mom was involved. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. My mom was in full host mode, even though it wasn't her house, bustling around and loudly making sure everyone noticed how much effort she'd put into helping with the event. My brother was already there, sitting on the couch and scrolling through his phone, looking unbothered as usual. I hadn't even made it to the kitchen when my mom loudly mentioned, almost as if on cue, how disappointing it was that her sister, my aunt, had decided not to come. Her voice carried through the room, clearly meant for everyone to hear. Then came the twist. She pointed out that it was probably because of an argument I'd had with my aunt years ago. I froze. It wasn't just the audacity of blaming me for my aunt's absence, it was the fact that the argument she mentioned hadn't even been a big deal. My aunt and I had disagreed on something trivial at a family BBQ 3 years ago, but we'd laughed it off the next day. If anything, my mom had been the one constantly stirring the pot, bringing it up whenever she wanted to criticize me. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, where a small crowd of family members had already gathered, including my brother. My mom, clearly waiting for her moment, zeroed in on me and repeated her theory, this time directly to my face. She made it sound like I'd personally offended my aunt so deeply that she'd decided to skip the party altogether. I kept my tone even and simply said that I didn't think my argument with my aunt had anything to do with her decision not to come. I pointed out that my aunt had actually RSVP'd, yes, but had mentioned to me earlier in the week that she wasn't feeling well. It wasn't unusual for her to skip events when she was under the weather, something everyone in the family knew. My mom didn't miss a beat. She pivoted, claiming that even if my aunt hadn't explicitly said it was my fault, my negative energy was probably a contributing factor. My brother, of course, chimed in to back her up, shaking his head like I was the worst person alive for ruining the vibe of a party I hadn't even been at yet. That's when I decided to stop being defensive and let her words work against her. I calmly asked if anyone else had spoken to my aunt recently. My mom faltered, glancing at my brother, who looked equally confused. My cousin, who had been quietly sipping her drink in the corner, suddenly spoke up. She said she'd talked to my aunt just a couple of days ago and confirmed that it was health-related, not drama-related. The room went silent for a moment. Instead of apologizing or even acknowledging that she might have been wrong, my mom immediately shifted gears. She blamed another cousin, suggesting that their recent disagreement over family finances might have been the real reason my aunt didn't show up. It was such an obvious deflection that even my brother looked uncomfortable. The conversation moved on, but I wasn't done yet. I discreetly started recording bits of the interaction on my phone. My mom's pattern was becoming clearer to everyone in the room, not just me. Over the next hour, she continued to throw around blame, finding ways to subtly, or not so subtly, shift every little hiccup of the evening onto someone else. The food wasn't served on time. Apparently, I hadn't helped enough in the kitchen. One of the kids spilled a drink on the carpet. She made a point to mention how my clumsiness must run in the family. By the time we sat down to eat, my cousins were whispering to me about how exhausting her behavior was. One of them even rolled their eyes when my mom launched into a dramatic retelling of another incident where I had supposedly offended someone years ago. But her version of the story didn't line up with what actually happened. I calmly asked her for details like where and when it supposedly occurred. She stumbled over her words, clearly flustered, before finally snapping that I was being argumentative. The rest of the meal was awkward, with people exchanging glances but no one willing to outright call her out. After dinner, I decided it was time to leave. My mom looked visibly annoyed as I said my goodbyes, but I didn't give her a chance to create another scene. Later that night, my cousins messaged me, sharing stories of their own experiences with her manipulation. They told me they were tired of her behavior and were glad someone was finally standing up to her, even if it was subtle. It was the first time I realized I wasn't alone in this. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I knew it was only a matter of time before her web of lies began to unravel completely. Update 2. It all started when I was helping my dad clear out some old paperwork. He'd recently moved into a smaller place and was finally sorting through years' worth of documents. I'd offered to lend a hand, partly to spend time with him and partly to take a break from the drama my mom seemed determined to stir up. We were working through a box of random files, old tax returns, receipts, and insurance papers, when I came across a folder labeled Education Fund. I opened it, curious, and quickly realized what I was looking at. These were records of a fund my parents had set up years ago to cover my brother's college expenses. My dad, ever organized, had meticulously documented every contribution, withdrawal, and expense. Something didn't add up. The withdrawals listed didn't match what my dad had described when the fund was first set up. He'd always told us it was a joint account that both he and my mom contributed to equally. But from what I could see, nearly all the deposits came from him, and the withdrawals were suspiciously high, way more than what my brother's tuition and fees should have cost. I asked my dad if he knew about the discrepancies. At first, he seemed confused. He said my mom had been handling most of the payments, and he trusted her to manage it responsibly. But the numbers didn't lie. I pointed out a few particularly large withdrawals that didn't align with any of my brother's school expenses. My dad looked uneasy and said he'd need some time to think about it. A few days later, I decided to dig deeper. I asked my brother about his college costs, framing it as curiosity about how he managed his budget back then. He rattled off some rough figures, and they were nowhere near the amounts listed in the fund's withdrawals. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Armed with the records, I approached my dad again. This time, he couldn't ignore what was in front of him. The two of us went through every transaction line by line, and it became clear that my mom had been using the fund for things completely unrelated to my brother's education, personal shopping sprees, vacations, and even a down payment on a car. My dad was visibly upset but still hesitant to confront her. He said he didn't want to cause a fight without being absolutely sure. That night, my mom came over for dinner. I stayed quiet at first, letting my dad lead the conversation. He casually brought up the education fund, asking her if she remembered how they'd handled the expenses. Her tone shifted immediately. She got defensive, claiming that the withdrawals had all been necessary and that any discrepancies were likely due to unexpected costs my brother had during school. When my dad pressed further, mentioning the records we'd found, she turned on me. She accused me of stirring up trouble and even suggested that I'd somehow tampered with the documents to make her look bad. It was so over the top that I couldn't help but laugh. I calmly pulled out the folder and handed it to her, pointing out the dates and amounts. Her face went pale for a moment before she doubled down, claiming the records were incomplete and didn't tell the whole story. My brother walked in just as the argument was heating up. He looked confused, so I explained what was happening and showed him the documents. At first, he tried to defend her, saying there must have been a reason for the withdrawals. But as we went through the records together, even he couldn't deny that something was off. For the first time, I saw doubt creep into his expression. He admitted he'd never really questioned where the money came from or how it was spent because my mom had always assured him everything was under control. The next day, my dad decided to call a family meeting. He wanted everyone to have a chance to address the situation openly. My mom arrived looking smug, clearly expecting to take control of the narrative. But this time, she wasn't prepared for what came next. My dad laid out the evidence in front of everyone, going through the records methodically. My brother backed him up, recounting our conversation and confirming that the expenses didn't match his actual college costs. At first, my mom tried to dismiss the whole thing, claiming it was an attack on her character. When that didn't work, she accused me of turning the family against her. But the more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was deflecting. My aunt, who had been skeptical of her for years, finally spoke up. She admitted she'd seen similar behavior from my mom in the past, particularly when it came to finances. By the end of the meeting, my mom was cornered. She stormed out, but the damage was done. my cousins reached out later, offering to share their own stories of financial irregularities involving her. It was like a floodgate had opened. That night, I started putting together a comprehensive timeline of events. With the support of my dad, brother, and cousins, I knew I had everything I needed to expose the full extent of her lies. The next step was clear: a public confrontation where the entire family could see the truth. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about breaking the cycle of manipulation once and for all. Update 3. It took about 2 weeks to organize the family meeting. My dad, brother, and a couple of my cousins were all on board, which made it easier to get everyone together. The tension leading up to it was thick. My mom had started calling around, asking relatives if they'd noticed me acting out recently. She framed it as concern, but everyone knew she was fishing for allies. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at my dad's place. The turnout was better than I expected. My dad, brother, aunts, uncles, and most of my cousins were there. Even a couple of extended family members who usually stayed out of drama showed up, curious about what was going on. My mom arrived last, carrying an air of confidence like she was about to squash a petty misunderstanding. Once everyone settled, I connected my laptop to the TV. My dad gave a brief introduction, explaining why we'd called the meeting and emphasizing that this was about clearing the air, not pointing fingers. That's when I started the slideshow. The first slide was simple: a timeline of key events involving the education fund. I walked everyone through the deposits my dad had made, the withdrawals my mom had handled, and the discrepancies we'd uncovered. I included screenshots of the account statements and matched them with receipts for non-education related expenses, like a luxury handbag and an all-inclusive vacation package she'd taken without telling anyone. The room was dead silent, except for the occasional sharp intake of breath. When I finished that section, I moved on to a broader pattern of behavior. This part was trickier, because it involved calling out her manipulation without making it seem like I was piling on. I included examples of her deflecting blame over the years, like the time she convinced everyone that I'd ruined Christmas by not buying my brother an expensive gift, or when she claimed I was the reason my aunt skipped a family dinner. My cousins chimed in here, sharing their own stories of being blamed for things they had nothing to do with. Each story seemed to validate the last, creating a snowball effect. About halfway through, my mom's confidence cracked. She interrupted, claiming I was twisting the facts and dragging her through the mud for no reason. But her outburst didn't land the way she'd hoped. Instead of rallying to her side, the family pushed back. My dad asked her point blank to explain the education fund discrepancies. When she couldn't, my brother stepped in, visibly angry for the first time. He apologized to me in front of everyone, admitting he'd been blind to her behavior for years, and that he now understood how manipulative she'd been. The room shifted. For the first time in my life, I felt like the family saw her for who she really was. My aunt, who'd been quiet up to that point, spoke up, recounting how my mom had once borrowed money from her under false pretenses and never paid it back. Another cousin shared how my mom had tried to pit her against her siblings by spreading lies. One by one, people started connecting the dots, realizing how many of their own experiences fit the same pattern. My mom's frustration boiled over. She stood up, accusing me of orchestrating the entire meeting to humiliate her and tear the family apart. She tried to storm out dramatically, but my dad calmly told her she wasn't leaving until we finished. She sat back down, clearly seething. The final slide was a list of proposed boundaries. I kept it simple: more transparency with shared family finances, clear communication, and accountability. My dad announced that he'd be taking legal steps to recover the misused funds and prevent further financial mishandling. My mom looked furious but didn't say a word. When the meeting ended, my mom left without saying goodbye to anyone. As soon as she was gone, my cousins and aunts gathered around me, thanking me for having the courage to stand up to her. They admitted they'd been scared to speak out before, afraid of her retaliation. My brother pulled me aside and apologized again, this time promising to be a better sibling and start rebuilding our relationship. He seemed genuine, and for the first time in a long while, I believed him. Over the next few days, I started receiving messages from extended family members who'd heard about the meeting. Some expressed shock, others shared their own stories of being manipulated by my mom. The support was overwhelming, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But my mom, of course, wasn't done. She started spreading rumors about me, claiming I'd fabricated the entire presentation out of spite. But the family wasn't buying it. My dad reassured everyone that the evidence was solid, and my brother even posted a public apology on social media, taking responsibility for enabling her behavior in the past and thanking me for exposing the truth. Meanwhile, my dad began consulting with a lawyer to explore options for recovering the money she'd taken from the education fund. It wasn't about the amount as much as it was about holding her accountable. The family also agreed to new norms, more open communication, and less tolerance for toxic behavior. While my mom was more isolated than ever, the rest of us felt closer. Family gatherings became more relaxed without her constant presence, and my brother and I started spending more time together. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Update 4? It didn't take long for my mom to retaliate after the family meeting. Within a week, she started reaching out to mutual friends and extended family, spinning the narrative that I'd orchestrated the whole thing out of jealousy and spite. She painted herself as the victim of an elaborate smear campaign, claiming I'd fabricated evidence and manipulated everyone against her. At first, a few relatives bought into her story. I started noticing the change in tone from some of them during conversations. One aunt, who had seemed supportive at the meeting, suddenly became cold and distant. Another cousin messaged me, asking why I was so determined to destroy the family. It was frustrating, but I didn't let it rattle me. Instead, I sent a short, factual message to the extended family group chat, offering to share the evidence I'd presented at the meeting with anyone who had questions. I attached a few key documents to back up my point, leaving no room for doubt. That approach worked better than I expected. Over the next few days, several relatives reached out privately to apologize for jumping to conclusions. They said they could see through my mom's attempts to discredit me and appreciated my transparency. Some even shared their own stories of being manipulated by her in the past, adding more weight to the pattern of behavior we'd exposed. Meanwhile, my mom turned her attention toward my brother. She started calling and texting him constantly, accusing him of betrayal for siding with me during the meeting. At first, he tried to keep the peace, but her attacks became relentless. Eventually, he stood his ground, telling her that her lies and manipulations had caused harm to the entire family and that she needed to take responsibility for her actions. From what he later told me, it was the first time he'd ever directly challenged her. Around this time, the floodgates really opened. More extended family members started sharing their experiences with my mom. Stories of financial manipulation, guilt-tripping, and outright lies began pouring in. One uncle revealed that she'd borrowed money from him years ago, claiming it was to help my dad, only to later find out she'd used it for a personal shopping spree. Another cousin recalled how she'd nearly caused a rift in their family by spreading false rumors about a sibling dispute. While all of this was unfolding, my dad continued pushing for accountability regarding the education fund. He confronted my mom directly about the misused money, giving her an ultimatum: cooperate and return what she could, or face legal action. She responded by threatening to sue me for defamation, claiming that the presentation I'd given at the family meeting was filled with lies. Her threat didn't faze me. I consulted with a lawyer, who reviewed the evidence I'd compiled and assured me that her case wouldn't hold up in court. The lawyer even suggested that if she pursued it, we could countersue for damages, given the overwhelming proof of her financial mismanagement. When word of her legal threats reached the family, it backfired spectacularly. Relatives who had been on the fence about the situation began cutting ties with her, tired of her escalating drama. Despite the mounting backlash, my mom made a brief attempt to reconcile. She showed up unannounced at my dad's house one afternoon, offering a lukewarm apology and claiming she wanted to move past the drama. It was obvious she wasn't truly sorry, she just wanted to regain control of the narrative. My dad refused to entertain her demands, reminding her that accountability was non-negotiable. She left in a huff, muttering about how ungrateful we all were. On the brighter side, the fallout brought the rest of the family closer together. My dad, brother, and cousins formed a tight-knit support network, vowing to hold my mom accountable and ensure she couldn't manipulate anyone else. My brother, in particular, made a visible effort to mend our relationship. He started reaching out more often, inviting me to family gatherings, and even publicly acknowledged his role in enabling our mom's behavior. He posted a heartfelt message on social media, apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner and thanking me for standing up for the family. The ripple effect of the meeting and its aftermath was undeniable. Several relatives chose to cut contact with my mom entirely, unwilling to tolerate her toxic behavior any longer. Others, while not completely cutting ties, set firm boundaries to protect themselves from her manipulation. For the first time in years, family events felt lighter and more peaceful without the constant tension she brought to the table. Meanwhile, I kept responding to any lingering rumors with calm, factual rebuttals. My approach seemed to disarm her attempts to spread misinformation, further isolating her within the family. Slowly but surely, the truth was winning out, and her influence was fading. Although my mom continued to make occasional attempts to stir up drama, they grew less frequent and less effective as time went on. The rest of us were finally free to rebuild our relationships without the shadow of her manipulation hanging over us. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time, I felt confident that the truth would continue to stand on its own, no matter how hard she tried to distort it. Update 5. After the dust settled, the changes in the family dynamic were impossible to ignore. My mom's isolation deepened quickly. With most of the family keeping their distance, her influence waned significantly. Relatives who used to hang on to her every word were now cautious, aware that siding with her often came at a price. She spent the following weeks reaching out to anyone who would listen, trying to rewrite the story in her favor. But with the truth already out, fewer people believed her. As word about the family meeting spread, the small community where we lived began to piece things together. My mom had built a reputation as a social butterfly, but her knack for stirring up drama wasn't new. Now that her behavior was exposed, neighbors and acquaintances started pulling back, choosing to steer clear of her. Some even reached out to me or my dad, expressing regret for ever believing her stories in the first place. It became clear that her web of manipulation extended far beyond the family. Meanwhile, my dad took decisive action to address the financial mess she'd created. With help from a lawyer, he finalized an agreement with her, recovering a portion of the funds she'd misused from the education account. It wasn't a full recovery, she had already spent much of it, but it was enough to make a difference. More importantly, the agreement ensured she couldn't touch any remaining joint accounts or assets. For the first time in years, my dad felt like he had control over his finances again. The most unexpected change, though, came from my brother. For so long, he'd been caught in my mom's narrative, playing the role of the golden child. But after everything came to light, he made a genuine effort to reconnect with me. He started small, suggesting we grab coffee or go for a walk. Soon, he was initiating family get-togethers without our mom, something he'd never done before. He even invited me to his apartment for a game night, something that felt almost surreal after years of tension. Around this time, my mom made one last-ditch effort to regain control. She sent me a long, rambling email, accusing me of destroying the family and painting herself as the victim. It was full of the usual guilt trips and deflections, but it didn't hit the way it used to. I didn't respond. Instead, I reinforced the boundaries I'd set after the family meeting: minimal contact unless she took full accountability for her actions. Predictably, she didn't. As my mom's influence faded, the rest of the family began to heal. Extended relatives who had been distant started showing up more often. Without her constant interference, communication improved, and old rifts began to mend. My cousins, inspired by the meeting, took a stand as well. They confronted her about past incidents where she had manipulated or lied to them. Each confrontation further chipped away at her power, leaving her with fewer allies. My relationship with my brother continued to grow stronger. We started opening up about our shared experiences growing up under our mom's influence. It was strange realizing how much we had in common despite being cast in such different roles. He apologized again, not just for siding with her, but for not questioning her sooner. We began supporting each other in ways we never had before, and for the first time, I felt like I had a real sibling bond. Outside of family, I threw myself into my career. With the weight of my mom's manipulation off my shoulders, I found new energy and focus. I took on bigger projects, networked more aggressively, and even landed a promotion. The confidence I gained from standing up to her spilled into other areas of my life, and it felt incredible to channel that into something productive. The community also rallied around me in unexpected ways. Friends who had once been skeptical of my side of the story reached out to apologize, admitting they'd been fooled by my mom's charm. Even people who barely knew us acknowledged her toxic behavior, sharing their own encounters with her manipulations. It was validating to know that the truth was finally undeniable. Despite her dwindling support, my mom still tried to regain control. She showed up uninvited to a family birthday party, but my dad turned her away, calmly explaining that she wasn't welcome unless she agreed to respect the boundaries we'd set. It was a firm stance that reinforced the new dynamic we were building as a family. Without her, family events became something they hadn't been in years, peaceful. Birthdays, holidays, and reunions were free of drama. People laughed more, stayed longer, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. It was like a cloud had lifted, and everyone could finally breathe. Looking back, I know the confrontation was necessary. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if it was worth the effort. But seeing the family rebuild itself, seeing my dad reclaim his independence, and watching my brother grow into a more self-aware person made it clear that it was the right thing to do. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the constant blame, the manipulation, and the toxic cycle my mom had created. The family was stronger, more united, and finally able to move forward. And as for me, I was hopeful for the future, ready to start a new chapter surrounded by people who truly cared.